Hello, welcome to part 6 of the PayFi series. In part 5, we discussed infrastructure inversion and we leaned into a deeper discussion on the emerging field of incumbents by help of a framework based upon Railworks. And in this video, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into looking at the incumbents. However, we must recognize that this is an emerging field and our data is limited. So what we can say in a qualified, educated fashion about the competitive landscape when being specific about competitors, individual competitors, is of course limited. But let's start with Solana, because in part 5, Solana was the blockchain that I put the most emphasis on. And that is because, they're likely going to lead in terms of volume and visibility. And that's especially in the Americas and part of Asia, where it has the mind share, or at least the lion part of the mind share. The developer base and the stable connectivity is large on Solana. They are basically positioned to lead, I would say. But if the regulators tighten the screw on things like anonymity and require more compliance frameworks, then Solana native PayFi may hit, let's say, a ceiling unless new guardrails are added as an afterthought to the Solana blockchain. Stellar, on the other hand, will quietly grow in the background, I believe. They are very focused on remittance use cases, humanitarian aid, and they work with NGOs. And in connection to remittance, obviously, their focus is on emerging markets, Africa, regions such as Latin America and Southeast Asia. The thing is, Stellar has a long history. It has received in the past reasonable traction, and we must acknowledge that Stellar commands today a market cap of 9 billion, actually up from 6 billion just 2-3 months ago. So there is definitely a solid basis, but it is a solid basis built on an absolutely outdated technology stack. Stellar lacks in many aspects, and we will talk more about that later. But things such as zero knowledge tech is non-existing, and they will absolutely have problems as we move ahead and as it becomes clear what is truly needed for, let's say, more modern type DeFi flavored DeFi use cases. It is required for Stellar to sort of, I would say almost reinvent themselves if they want to play a role in the longer run. I think to a certain extent that Stellar realizes this, and that is why they have this niche focus on remittances and humanitarian aid, NGOs, and emerging markets. Concordium is a dark horse. If MiCA enforcements get serious in Europe, and if identity-first stablecoin issuance becomes a trend, then Concordium could emerge as the compliance standard for Euro-backed PayFi. I think the edge that Concordium could potentially hold will be the clearest when regulatory clarity is no longer optional, but required from governments towards banks and institutions that needs full audit trails. In the past, in terms of DeFi, one would have said it isn't necessary to consider what the regulatory requirements are for institutions, but in terms of PayFi, bridging the gap and using stablecoins to enable institutional adoption, we must suddenly broaden our scope and basically look at the full extent of regulatory requirements also from traditional finance, and that entails Concordium has a much better chance at making its mark. Chains like Algorand, Polygon, or just in general Ethereum layer 2s, well, they are bound to join the race as well, but they will need to either provide serious compliance frameworks or come with killer use cases that are more than just clones of what the incumbent Stellar, Concordium, and Solana have already provided to make their mark and to have a chance. So I would bet that in 2 years, Solana still wins in terms of speed and volume, while I think Stellar will continue to hold onto a dominant position in their niche of humanitarian, fintech, and remittance. And Concordium, I believe, could leap ahead, in particular in highly regulated regions, for now Europe, but probably also once the US sorts their political turbulence around the Stable Act for stablecoins, or the Genius Act, and also in the US, Concordium could leap ahead and play a significant role. I want to say that market cap, I already alluded to this, but it matters, not in the way that most tend to think. In terms of crypto native use cases, market cap has been tremendously important. We already discussed that Solana is able to attract builders and just generally has broader appeal to use cases because of their size. But for the PayFi sector, as it merges, as it bridges the gap to traditional finance and onboards institutions, the perspective on market cap as being the predominant indicator of trustworthiness will start to wane, because institutions, what matters for them is more who's compliant, who's trusted, who can offer a stable and transparent infrastructure that allows compliance in terms of regulatory requirements from the government. And market cap in that aspect plays a less significant role, because it isn't an indicator of compliance. I would say to the contrary, a highly compliant project has paid its price, like we've seen with Concordium. Yeah, I think Concordium has a chance, but it is a different game. The future of PayFi, in terms of attracting use cases, in terms of attracting partnerships, is not about retail hype, or it's not about, oh, we have this and this DeFi volume. No, it's more about positioning the blockchain itself as a regulated and serious player that the institutions are willing to work with. And if we look at Concordium and weigh them pound for pound, the team, what they are trying to communicate, how they are communicating, I think they come out very strong. And I see a chance that Concordium could become sort of the Switzerland of PayFi, that is neutral, compliant, and transparent, and that would allow Concordium to punch much above its weight in terms of market cap. I think the wildcard is adoption. If one large use case takes off, like a major euro stablecoin, that could drastically change a lot of things and really raise the odds for Concordium to play a dominant role in the future of PayFi. So acknowledging the need for a large, significant, prominent use case to supercharge Concordium adoption is crucial. It needs to be a kind of flagship use case, one that's live and very visible and clearly delivering real-world volume and value. Ideally, something backed by a euro stablecoin, with identity and compliance being key parameters. Maybe payroll application, small mid-sized enterprise financing scheme, or some cross-border business-to-business transaction system. Having such a use case would be a credible signal, I would say, to the market that Concordium is no longer just theory, it has arrived, so to speak. I think, secondly, Concordium, once it has this flagship use case, then it needs to scale that use case rather fast. Not by, frankly, we've seen in the past, chasing 10 ideas, but making one thing, like also acknowledged by the new management, and ensure that works across multiple jurisdictions with, if possible, multiple partners and a variety of integrations. I think we could look to USDC and what they did for Ethereum. One killer stablecoin, well, it basically sparked a wave of apps and adoption. Thirdly, Concordium must lock in regulatory goodwill. That means leveraging the MiCA readiness and pushing forward for audits and positioning itself basically as the chain governments and stablecoin issuers generally trust. Concordium already has the tech, but the narrative and the marketing needs to be pushed forward. I think what we have seen is tremendous improvements in that aspect, but there's still much to do in my humble opinion. And I would like to touch a little bit upon that later on. I think fourth, on the back of such a flagship use case, Concordium must also create a kind of pull for developers. That means that grants must be more clearly positioned. We have seen after the arrival of the new management that the grants program has no longer received focus. That does not mean that it's not ongoing, but it means that we have not seen it advertised and pushed to the extent that it was in the past. And I'm just saying that once Concordium has a flagship use case, then the grant program needs to take center stage, and it needs to come along with better onboarding mechanisms and integration with wallets, and particularly APIs needs to take the center stage and become tools for putting Concordium on a trajectory where it becomes perhaps not as easy as on some other blockchains to onboard, but it closes a great part of the gap. I think the most important, as the fifth element following a flagship use case, is basically for Concordium to tell a better story. Like I said, a lot of improvements has already happened, but we really do need a bold and very public narrative about why PayFi needs identity, compliance, and auditability. And that is something that needs allies, I think, to echo across the Web3 space. Again, we want to reach out and close the gap to Web2, but most investors are still coming from the Web3 space. So on the one hand, while we're talking about what is required to gain traction with use cases in legacy finance, we must still acknowledge that for now at least, investors and thereby token price appreciation is achieved via mainly talking to the Web3 community, so to speak. A flagship use case needs to be positioned as a bold story that underpins Concordium as coming of age. So to wrap up part 6 of the PayFi series, because I see I've now spoken for, well, it's approaching 15 minutes. Let me just summarize to ensure that you have the proper key takeaways and lead into episode 7. So there's no doubt Solana leads in speed and volume. Stellar holds the strong niche of humanitarian remittance, and Concordium is the dark horse, the one with the clearest compliance advantage, and its position to shine when, and notice I'm saying when and not if, regulation is no longer optional but becomes required. Still, that's not enough for Concordium to break through. 5 things that we covered are essential. Number 1, it needs a flagship use case. It needs to scale on the basis of that flagship use case and fast. It needs to ensure that it's backed by regulatory trust and that it is followed by renewed developer momentum in the wake of the use case. And it needs, finally and most importantly, to be wrapped in a bold, confident narrative that cuts through both Web 2 and Web 3. And that's the path, in my view, forward for Concordium as it looks now. In the next episode, episode 7, I will begin to look at how Concordium is already setting that story in motion through its improved communication, its much clearer positioning, and basically architecture that is designed for simplicity, privacy, and real-world trust.